Welcome to our MJA podcast, the series Deep into the Woods, Episode 3, Part 1. My name is Mark Harper, and I am your host for tonight's podcast. I am the lead investigator and one of the founding partners of MJA. Joining me later on this podcast will be Dan Kincaid. He is one of our profilers and researchers here at MJA. Tonight's episode is Welcome to Serial Killer Avenue. California serial killer Mack Ray Edwards operated from 1953 to 1970. Edwards claims to have murdered at least 6 children in Los Angeles County, California. But there are many investigators who claim that Edwards had more than six victims. As a heavy equipment operator contracted by Caltrans, Edwards worked on freeways. The body of one of his victims was found underneath the Santa Ana Freeway, and he claimed to have disposed of another victim under the Ventura Freeway. Edwards killed 3 children from 1953 to 1956 and 3 more in 1968 to 1969. Edwards and a teenage male accomplice kidnapped 3 girls from their home in Salomar, California. When the girls escaped, Edwards surrendered to police and confessed to molesting and murdering 6 children. After 3 bodies were recovered, Edwards pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to death. In 1971, Edwards hung himself with a television cord in his cell in San Quentin State Prison. California serial killer Mack Ray Edwards. Known victims: Stella Darlene Nolan. Stella Darlene Nolan disappeared on June 20th, 1953 from Compton, California. It's been reported that the 8-year-old was child killer Mack Ray Edwards' first victim. Edwards took LAPD detectives to the shoulder of a Santa Ana Freeway in Downing, California. They discovered the body of Stella Darlene Nolan, whom Edwards killed and buried there in 1953. Nolan's remains have been found about 17 years later after her murder. Gary Rochet. On November 26, 1968, a male homicide victim had been found in his home in Granda Hills, California. The 16-year-old Gary Rochet was found shot to death in his own home. Edwards confessed to killing the 16-year-old. Donald Allen Todd. Child serial killer Mack Ray Edwards fatally shot 13-year-old Don Allen Todd of Pacoma, California on May 16, 1969. Edwards shot Todd after trying to molest Todd. Edwards confessed to 3 additional killings. Because their bodies were not recovered, he was not charged with these murders. Donald Lee Baker, 15 years of age, and Brenda Jo Howe, 12 years of age, of Azusa, California, who disappeared together on August 6, 1956. On August 6, 1956, Baker and Howe was bicycling in the San Gabriel Canyon, Los Angeles County, California, area near the Glendora Mountain Road. After it was discovered that Baker and Howe were missing, an extensive search failed to turn up anything except their bicycles and Brenda's jacket. Brenda Jo Howe is Edwards' wife's sister. Roger Dale Madison, 15 years old, of Salmar, California, disappeared on December 16, 1968. Child killer Mack Ray Edwards confessed to killing Madison. Roger Dale Madison was a friend and a classmate of the son of the serial killer, Mack Ray Edwards. Edwards stated that the body of Roger Dale Madison was dumped in a grave in a freeway construction zone north of Thousand Oaks, and then his body was covered. Land just off of 23 Freeway in Moore Park, located in Ventura County, is being searched and dug up in hopes of finding the remains of 15-year-old Roger Dale Madison. Possible victims. Edwards may have committed other murders by his own account was inconsistent. While in prison, he claimed to have killed 18 children. On March 23, 1957, 8-year-old Thomas Eldon Bowman disappeared from Upper Arroyo Seco Canyon in Pasadena, Los Angeles County, California. The 8-year-old was hiking with his family in the Arroyo Seco Canyon area. The 8-year-old Bowman ran ahead to the car. When the family arrived back at the car, Bowman was nowhere to be found. 7-year-old Bruce Creeman went missing on July 13, 1960, from Angeles National Forest in Los Angeles County, California. 7-year-old Creeman was last seen on July 13, 1960, near Buckhorn Flat in the Angeles National Forest. A group of 80 Los Angeles YMCA camp children were led on a supervised hike near Buck Flat in Angeles National Forest. A massive search party for Creeman failed to uncover any clues to his disappearance. 11-year-old Karen Lynn Tompkins went missing on August 18, 1961, from Torrance, California. Karen was last seen at approximately 5 p.m. after leaving an arts and crafts class which was held at Halldale Avenue Elementary School. 11-year-old Tompkins went only 5 blocks away from her home, but she never arrived. Child serial killer Mack Ray Edwards confessed in early 1970 to abducting Tompkins from Torrance, California, and killing the 11-year-old. 11-year-old Dorothy Gale Brown went missing on July 3, 1962, from Torrance, California. On July 4, 1962, Brown's body was discovered from the ocean at Corona del Mar, Newport Beach, where she had been molested and drowned. Child serial killer struck in Santa Barbara, California, in Santa Barbara County. 7-year-old Ramona Irene Price reported missing in August of 1961 or September 2nd of 1961. Ramona Irene Price disappeared without a trace. Confessions from a child serial killer who operated from the 1950s to the 1970s, claims he abducted Ramona Irene Price. Mack Edwards claims to have buried Price several miles down Hollister Avenue at the 101 overcrossing and Winchester Canyon Road Bridge. Let's take a pause for the cause, and when we come back, our guest for tonight's podcast will be Dan Kincaid, who is a profiler and researcher for MJA. Welcome, Dan, to our MJA podcast, Deep Into the Woods, Episode 3, Part 1. Welcome to Serial Killer Avenue. How are you tonight, Dan?
Pretty good, Mark. How are you?
I'm just fine. Dan, can you name some of the types of serial killers?
Well, in the School of Criminal Profiling, there's 3 types of serial killers: organized, disorganized, and mixed. Organized serial killers are your Ted Bundys, who take the time to plan out every little single detail of crimes, from the type of victim to the location of the abductions. They even go as far as to set up a ruse, like having a cast on their arm for their victims. Then you have the disorganized serial killers. These are the type who abduct people, leave behind evidence. A lot of people like Ed Kemper, who have mental problems, which causes them to go into psychotic frenzies. Then you have the mixed type, which, although they are organized, have some traits which are sloppy throughout their crime scene. A classic serial killer that displays both organized and disorganized traits is Jack the Ripper. And this could be shown in his crime scenes and even throughout the variety of suspects in the case, from the crazy Aaron Kosminski all the way to the royal princes of England.
And
You
where would you rate child killer Mack Ray Edwards?
I would rate him somewhere in between. You could see there's some type of organization to his abductions, given the time frames. Although in the suspected abductions, there are various inconsistencies, so his pattern varies, which is something you usually find with cross-country serial killers, because they're on the move, and a lot of their victims are opportunistic, so they never can nail down the same set of circumstances twice.
And do you think the children knew something was wrong before he abducted them?
That's hard to say. You know, some people have a better virile instinct than others. Some of his victims were a little older, 13, 15. Others were a little bit younger. I would suspect the older ones could probably tell there's something off about him. But a lot of serial killers are master manipulators, especially child abductors. You know, it's a saying in profiling that the best profilers are the child abductors themselves, because they're able to figure out the exact right moment to snatch a child.
Of all the serial killers you have studied, from 1 to 10, with 1 being the highest, what number would you give Edwards?
In terms of what? Brutality, organization?
Overall, he only worked in the California area, so 1 state. So overall, what number would you give him on a 1 to 10 scale?
I would give him a 7. And the reason I say a 7 is even though his abduction count is somewhat low compared to other possible serial killers, because he only has a list of about 5 known victims. Everything else is only possible victims. So you can't speculate one way or the other. But given the fact that some of his victims are young children, that puts him at a higher spot on the scale for me personally. You know, Dr. Michael Stone, the famous forensic psychologist, he used to do the scale of evil based on mental deficiencies and torture and things like that. Anyone that's seen the show Most Evil on Investigation Discovery will know what I'm talking about. But for me, on a personal level, I put people who abduct children a little higher up on that scale. I don't know about you.
And just by reading Mack Ray Edwards' other crimes, do you think he has more than 20 victims?
It's very possible, because serial killers with a variety of crimes on their rap sheet have an addiction to criminal behavior. You see this with serial killers like Danny Rolling and Israel Keys. They're all over the map because although they have the impulse to murder, they have the impulse to commit other types of criminal activity, and that impulse to do things like steal or commit rapes or arsons or whatever is a very powerful impulse that they can't control. That need for criminality, be it caused by a financial need for money or just because they enjoy doing other types of criminal activity.
And why do you think Edwards had so many different ways of killing his victims? Some he buried underneath highways, some he shot, and some were thrown in waterways. What would be your thinking on his drastic changes he made in the ways he killed?
Whenever you're profiling a case from a psychological perspective, you look at 3 different things. What we call the signature, victimology, and MO. MO is modus operandi, what you do in order to successfully commit the crime. In the case of Maura Murray, you and I talk about it all the time, how the killer leaves no evidence. Well, leaving no evidence isn't really a signature, it's more MO, because MO is what you do to accomplish the crime itself. Signature is the psychological need that you have to fulfill on a personal level, which is what makes the crime worthwhile for the serial killer, expressing whatever rage or sexual tension they feel. The other thing we looked at is victimology, which examines the victims themselves. How old were they? Did they have friends, enemies? Were they involved in anything in their life, school, or otherwise that would, put them in any danger? And by looking at those 3 things, we start to see our killer, the way they operate, their signature and MO. Now, a lot of profilers will tell you that signature doesn't change because even though the MO might change so they could better accomplish the crime, the signature will always be the same because the psychological need doesn't change. I don't believe that. The psychological need changes until it finds where it wants to be. So you have the MO and the signature always changing. And as those things change, even the victimology might change. Now, why is all this important? Because as you look at his scale with murdering the victims at different ages, killing them in different ways, and then disposing of them in different ways, what you see is he's becoming a more sophisticated criminal over time. The way you tell a serial killer that's evolving is because even though that MO might stay the same at first, as a killer breaks into houses and rapes women, the one way you know it's a serial killer is they keep upping the ante, or the MO changes, because the evolution shows a step forward in their thought process. So as he's doing all this different stuff, not only is he trying to dispose of the victims and abduct them better each time, he's also finding out what specifically turns him on. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, that's my next question. Do you think that Edwards had a thirst to kill, or do you think it was sexually motivated?
They're largely the same thing. Most serial killers, even though they don't murder in ways that would involve a traditional sex act, like oral sex or penetration, the motives are usually largely always sexual. Now, you have exceptions to that rule, like contract killers, like the Iceman Richard Klinsky, who murder people largely as serial killers for money. But with serial killers, largely the motive is always sexual. Where regular law enforcement and detectives get confused is they walk up on a crime scene, let's say, and they see the victim strangled with the penny stuffed in her mouth, but they don't find evidence of normal sexual penetration. So they assume that it maybe wasn't a rape, just a murder. But what they might not be understanding is the acts of sexual strangulation or stabbing can arouse the victim itself. Just like when we were talking about the Jason Dale Bolton case a minute ago, you can't really tell if it was sexual sadism or not, because you don't know, because you're not the offender, whether or not these acts sexually aroused him or what was going on in his head. But there are two types of torture, functional and sadistic. Functional torture is where you want information. Sadistic torture is done purely for pleasure. And in that you have what's called sexual sadism, where the offender derives actual physical arousal from the pain of his victim. Now, this pain doesn't always have to be inflicted in a sexual nature. It could be any form of humiliating nature, like we were discussing with Jason's case, when they cut off his testicles and humiliated him in that way. If that turns you on, that's a form of sexual sadism. Now, because, we found Mack Edwards victims in the various states that they were, with certain evidence destroyed when they're found in waterways and stuff like that, it's hard to tell because certain evidence get washed away, the scene gets altered. But it's not easy to tell if he got sexual pleasure. I would suggest, from the nature and the age of his victims, being that they were younger kids, there was probably a sexual element involved. A lot of times when younger victims are taken, it's not just for robbery. It's for some form of unique sexual torture. Regular truck drivers, they get into a lot of deviant sexual acts, but, normally it's with legal people of their own age. When you're abducting young children like you see on the scale of 13 and 15, that's usually for some sort of sexually sadistic need that needs to be fulfilled. Did I answer your question?
You sure did. Thank
I
you,
know
Dan.
sometimes I get long-winded.
That's fine. That's fine. Thank you, Dan, for being on the podcast. And you have a very good evening. And that's the end of tonight's podcast. Always remember, if you get bored with nothing to do, just take a walk deep out into the woods. You might be surprised what you might find. My name is Mark Harper, and good night from Plattsburgh, New York.
Thank you.